only talking about intonation today just because it's one of my favorite topics to talk about, because I find it's like the most important thing in playing in a way, because if it's out of tune, like nobody wants to listen. Um, and I want to talk a little bit about a couple things that we need in order to play in tune, and then talk about a couple exercises maybe, and then open it up to everybody to ask questions. And that can be intonation or no intonation, can be anything, whatever you want it to be. So I want to start with stating what intonation actually is, because every sound that we hear is just a vibration. And in physics, this vibration is propagated as an acoustic wave through a transmission medium. And that transmission medium can be gas, liquid, or solid. And humans receive such waves and perceive them by the brain. We can only perceive a certain frequency, so between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. Sound above that is called ultrasound, and we can't hear that. Bats can hear that, for example. And sounds below are called infrasound. The chamber tone that we usually refer to, the A, has a frequency of 440 hertz in the US. In Germany or Europe, it's a little bit different. It's somewhere between 442 and 444, depending on where you are going. And that means for instrumentalists, if you want to play together, you need to be playing the same frequency. If you don't, then those frequencies clash because the waves don't fit together, because one wave is moving slightly faster or slower than others. For us in real life, since most of us don't have perfect pitch, some of us are lucky enough that we do, intonation is, has nothing to do with the frequency, but it's rather a relationship between two notes. And that's often something that my students tend to forget. They work on individual notes, where rather to be successful with their intonation, they always need to be working on two notes, because one note doesn't mean anything without the other. And every interval that we play and every interval that we hear has a special sound, a sound that is distinguishable from one another because it has a certain character. And that's what we need to listen for when we want to play in tune. And for me, like to think about it that way, it's like it always helps me work on it a little bit more. It's just how my brain functions. I always want to know as many things as I can about a topic that interests me. But let's quickly state what we need to actually play in tune. Of course, we need a functioning saxophone with the correct key heights. And that is a very important thing because key heights change over time when we play. So even if we have a perfectly new saxophone or a perfectly overhauled saxophone, if we practice a lot and play a lot for like half a year, then the corks from the saxophone, they actually they get compressed, they get smaller, and therefore when the corks get smaller, the key heights get bigger. And I'm sure you're all aware of that, but sometimes we don't realize how quickly that happens when we play 4 to 6 hours a day. With vintage saxophones and sometimes modern saxophones, there is this thing called crescents. Crescents are these half moon slices of cork that get put into the tone hole, and you put them at the top portion of the tone hole, and with that the tone gets lower. So if you have a saxophone that has one note that is like drastically out of tune, you can change it with that. Also, there are such things as neckliners that are often used with soprano saxophones. They bring, that's like just a little liner that gets put in the neck of the soprano, and it brings down the second octave. But that's all something for a repairman. I like to not think about those things. I like to trust my repairman and just let him do his work. But it's important to know that if there is a note that is out of tune, that there is something that you can do about that. Of course, you need support and good posture. And then I always like to have a tuning mark on my neck. And just in case that you don't know what a tuning mark is, I brought my neck, and I hope you can see it. So I mark where I usually play. So this big line, that's my German line right now because I'm in Germany. So that's where I put my mouthpiece. And then depending on the room temperature or the outside temperature, I adjust accordingly after I've warmed up, but that's the place where I start. And then I have a mark for 440 actually, and I know where to put it for 443. And with traveling, that's very helpful because you're like almost in the right place. I want to share with you a little PowerPoint presentation just to talk about a couple things. Just pull that up. So Tim McAllister once said to me, if you hit a note slightly sharp or flat, you are playing the wrong note. And at that time that he said that, you know, like it didn't quite register for me, but it's like one of those statements that, you know, that was said to me a long time ago, and it keeps sticking with me because I keep realizing how true it is. Because you can't, I mean, you can adjust the note after you hit it when you hear that it's out of tune. But, you know, like by that point, somebody or you already heard the note sharp or flat. And that's the thing that you want to avoid. You want to pre-hear the interval in a way that you don't have to adjust the note. There are several things that, of course, alter the pitch. And I made a little chart about that. The mouthpiece position, the top line, I already mentioned that. So if you push that in, of course, you get sharper. And if you pull out, you get flatter. But that, of course, adjusts, that affects the entire saxophone. One thing that often gets misjudged are dynamics. So especially when we play crescendos, we tend to go flat, or if we go into the very, very soft ranges, we need to adjust our voicing in order not to get sharp. Also with the embouchure, if we are biting, we get sharper and stuff like that. You all know those things. I already mentioned the key heights, the temperature. The reed strength is one thing, because that's something that needs to be matched to the mouthpiece, the reed strength. And a hard reed makes you play sharper. And there are several things on the mouthpiece that adjust that change the pitch. So in fact, I once tried a mouthpiece and suddenly my saxophone was very out of tune. And I used a different mouthpiece, and that seemed to work well and so much better with that particular saxophone that a lot of the tendencies were suddenly gone. And that's something I didn't realize for a long time, that a mouthpiece and reed combination can have such a big effect on the instrument. I have a little chart from Van Doren with all the different aspects of a mouthpiece. You all know the tip opening, that's how far the reed is from the mouthpiece. That affects the pitch. And then the facing length, you know, like the facing length also affects the pitch, and it defines where you put the teeth on top of the mouthpiece. And with that, you have an entire different embouchure pressure on the reed. And if you remember the statement from before, the embouchure, biting and relax, is also firm or not firm. So depending on if that facing length is comfortable for your oral cavity and your head shape, it can have a big effect. So I used to believe that if you have a good mouthpiece, it works for a lot of people, but I don't believe that anymore. Because we are all built differently. And with that, you know, like it has to be different. Like we have to, you know, and that's why there are so many different setups and mouthpieces and reeds and saxophones on the market these days, because we are all so different. One big thing about playing in tune are is that you need to know the tuning tendencies of your saxophone. Every saxophone has tuning tendencies. Some are just better in tune and some are worse in tune, but all saxophones, I'd say, are out of tune. Common notes that are out of tune is, for example, the middle D, D sharp, and E. You know, they are usually sharp on a saxophone, or the high tones go sharp. I've never played a saxophone that's perfectly in tune, and I've tried a lot in my life. But it, you know, you won't find it. You won't find it because of the design of the saxophone. And then there's the thing called equal temperament and just temperament. And that's something that often gets misjudged too. So equal temperament is the way that a piano is tuned. That means you divide an octave by 12 steps, and they about all get the same distance between the notes. But mathematically, it doesn't work with natural tuning. So there's a design flaw in equal temperament. But if you're working with a tuner is often equal temperament. Now with tonal energy apps and stuff like that, you can switch it to just temperament, but most standard tuners just tune equal temperament. So that's when you work on hitting green or zero on the tuner, you're working on equal temperament. However, the way, for example, strings play or the way saxophones play is just temperament. And that's the bottom line. It's when you divide a string by half, then you get the octave and so on. You see the division here on the left side. But mathematically, that doesn't line up with equal temperament. You get different pitches. And those are the numbers at the bottom. Like an octave has 1,200 cent. But a major third has technically, mathematically 400 if I calculate the 4 half steps. But in just temperament, a major third has just 386.314 cent, which is the ratio of 5:4. And that's why when we play with strings or we play with saxophones, we tune the major third flat. And so every interval has a slightly different pitch in a way than in equal temperament. And I brought sound samples that I want to play for you, and I hope you can hear them. So the first sound sample I'm going to play are thirds in equal temperament. And then the second one will be thirds in just temperament. And you'll realize how much more the thirds in just temperament ring and sound correct. And now just temperament. Just temperament. To me, that sounds like almost two different intervals. Of course, when you play with piano, you have to tune to equal temperament. Unless the piano isn't playing the third, then you can make a choice. But if you want to play with saxophones or strings, you have to adjust for just temperament because it sounds very out of tune if you don't. So for me, I always ask myself the question, what's more important, a beautiful tone or the correct intonation? And that's something, one doesn't go without the other. You can't have the beautiful tone and sound out of tune, but you also can't play perfectly in tune and then don't sound very good. Often I find with my students, it's easier. Of course, they are working on both, but it's easier sometimes to focus on the intonation and get the pitch correct because that's the voicing that sits in the back of the tongue and in the throat, and then focus on the beautiful tone. It's easier to combine that way than to play with a beautiful tone and get used to the wrong pitches and then pre-hear them from that in the future incorrectly and then have to change your mind. So the question is, what is wrong or what is the problem if you play out of tune? And often it is that you can't hear the pitch correctly. And my favorite story about that is that when I started my doctorate at the Eastman School of Music, I played a Bisher Aristocrat saxophone, a vintage saxophone from 1938. And Ching Kwan would always say, Diane, your G sharp is flat. And he would say that every lesson. And he got to the point where he was like, you need to get a different saxophone because the G sharp is just too flat. So one day I brought a Yanagisawa to lessons, an A992, and I played for him. And he said, Diane, your G sharp is flat. So for me, that was the signal that the mind is just so much more important than one thinks it is. So then, of course, I started working on my mind, and with that, like the pitch on both saxophones improved. Another reason is that the embouchure sometimes isn't flexible enough yet to adjust the pitch up or down. Or as I mentioned before, that people work on notes and not intervals. So for me, a good embouchure always means a flexible embouchure. Like the embouchure that is not flexible, that cannot bend pitches, that cannot produce overtones, that is not a good embouchure. Then you need to work on developing that flexibility, and I will be talking about that in a little bit. You also, for a good intonation, you need well-trained ears. And you also need to be able to change the embouchure without changing the tone color. And in the beginning, when working on that, those things are sort of inseparable, but over time one learns to move the tongue in different places so that one does not affect the other. For me, personally, when I think about intonation, it's always most easy for me to think about the direction of the air. I know some people talk about raising or lowering their soft palate, or what exactly they do or where they open. But for me, thinking about the direction of the air is the most natural way of thinking about that. So what I mean with that is that normally you blow into the saxophone at the angle that your neck comes in often, or you kind of blow straight. So if you blow the air lower, it actually lowers the pitch. And what you do is like you adjust it with your soft palate and you adjust it a little bit with your jaw, but I don't have to think about that because I just think about the direction of the air. If you go higher, then of course the pitch goes higher. What goes with that is that for me, it becomes very easy to remember that movement that I'm doing. So if I, for example, my middle D is slightly sharp on my saxophone, and I know that I have to play that at about 4 p.m., knowing that at the top is noon, the bottom is 6, this is 3. So usually I play at about 3:30. And then I know the tendencies of my saxophone. I know about where I need to play that. And then from there, I fine tune, I work on the intervals. But for me, that's a good starting point and a good point to like come back the next day and work on that. Because, like there are a lot of factors, as you know, as I mentioned before, like the reed. So the next day you're playing with a different reed and it's slightly different. That's why the good hearing or the well-trained ears are so important. So for developing a flexible embouchure, one of the most important things is that you need to check that the reeds aren't too hard. Because if you are used to playing with too much pressure from your jaw, which often results in a darker tone, or you're not using enough air, then you really can't bend pitches. Then for me, overtones, practicing overtones is a major factor in working on intonation, because not only does it develop the flexibility in the voicing, but it also, overtones are an exercise for developing hearing, because over time you learn to place the notes and you learn to hear the notes. And that's part of playing in tune. So for me, there are several steps of playing overtones. The first step is to get them out. The second step is to get them without moving your jaw up and down. After that follows being able to slur them, which is much harder than just, getting them out. And after that, I go into fine tuning overtones. So you can practice your vibrato on overtones, because you'll learn to move the top of the front of the tongue and the jaw independently of your voicing, which is very important for tone development and intonation. I practice them with rhythms, overtones with rhythms, because that again separates the tip of the tongue from the back of the tongue. And the tip of the tongue is what we need for the tonguing. The back of the tongue is what we need for the intonation. So it's crucial in our playing that we can move both independently without one affecting the other. And then I practice them with dynamics, because if you practice your crescendo and decrescendo exercises, it develops the independence of the airstream. Practicing undertones is also a very fun exercise. That means putting the octave down and trying to play the octave below. I love pitch bends. I always have my students start with a palm key pitch bend. So you're trying to bend down a third from the palm keys. At the beginning, like most people get like a second or something like that, but I find it very important that you get to the point where you can bend a third. The opposite exercise of that is basically playing a G with a G sharp fingering, or it's not the opposite exercise, it's another exercise, because then you bend the G sharp down to the G basically, and then you do the same with the A fingering and so on. Pitch bending up is also very important, but it's like bending a pitch up is the range that you can do that with is much smaller than the range that you can bend down. After a student can play long tones very beautifully, I have them practice pitch bends on the neck and the mouthpiece, because before they can hold the pitch accurately, then the embouchure might be too unstable to do that. I also practice a mouthpiece pitch a lot. And that's something I do every day in my warm-up. I do 2 minutes of that. Because with mouthpiece pitch, you develop the flexibility. So you're trying to get at least an octave range just on the mouthpiece. So you develop the flexibility of the embouchure and the voicing, but you also learn the hearing. And then you can even play little tunes just on the mouthpiece. And then the question is, how do you actually practice intonation, right? In pieces and in general. And I find tuning charts very, very helpful, but I also find it very important that the statement that what you can't hear, you can't play. Because as I said before, tuning is always a relationship between two notes. So there are several methods of working on intonation. Of course, you can just take your tuner and you can try to hit every note on green, practicing equal temperament. But that's, like in real life, that's not what you do when you're playing. And therefore, I find it crucial to also practice with drones a lot. And you can use drones in a lot of different ways. I love the way that Tonal Energy shows you your pitch while holding a drone. And when you start learning intonation, that's just a very, very helpful tool. After that, like playing little scales, playing interval scales or folk songs or little pieces over drones. If I practice tonal works, I do that a lot on my pieces too. And you can do that, like most tuning apps have drones. There's also the tuning CD from Richard Swartz. There are drones on YouTube that are very, very good. Whichever method you use, all of them are better than not doing anything. But I find especially interval scales, like get my voicing in the right place and get my hearing in the right place. Of course, that's more inexact method than working with a tuner, but I find that both are very important. With the tuner, you can also have the tuner on, but have it off to the side once you are more comfortable in your tuning and know your tendencies. And then you can play the note and then look over if you're correct, because you don't always want to adjust to the tuner. The tuner at the beginning is just to learn your tendencies. And then the second step is to pre-hear the tendencies and know where you have to play. I also love working with goal notes. So if you know that, so instead of putting the drone on your root, you can put it on the note that you know is a problem. And that works perfectly, for example, with altissimo notes. So I put it on the altissimo note. So I hear the drone from the altissimo note playing the melody or the run that leads up to that note. And what that does is I actually learn to hear that note in my head, and that makes it more possible for me, or makes it easier for me to hear the notes before I hit the note. And that's important, because what you can't hear, you can't play. My favorite intonation book is actually the Londex intonation book, because it works with drones. So it's just simple little intervals, chords, or little scales that progressively get harder throughout the book. And it always goes through all the keys, or most of the keys. I realized that he leaves out some of them. Just like a couple minutes of that each day really helps me bring my intonation in check. And then it makes it that much easier for me to work on the pieces on intonation. That was a lot. If you have questions about that, we can talk about that in a second. My last point that I want to talk about, I love this statement. Maureen Ewan, she used to teach violin at Fredonia State University of New York. She now teaches somewhere at the West Coast in the US, said that to me. Because it's like, how do you know if you're in tune or not? And the fact is that you know when you're in tune. And if you're doubting, then you're not. And that's where you need to look when you're playing. These are tuning fingerings. I don't really believe in tuning fingerings, because they often cover up the fact that the embouchure isn't flexible enough in playing. They can be very helpful for some notes, for example, middle D or something like that. But most other notes, I always say that you have to be able to play every note on 0. And if you can't, you need to work on your embouchure, or you need to fix your saxophone. But then when you like play with others together, and you play in just temperament, and you want to lower for the third, or you want to slightly raise a note, that's where I love to use tuning fingerings. But if you rely on tuning fingerings with normal notes, then it gets really hard to play the thirds, for example. The last point I want to talk about is vibrato and intonation. And saxophonists, like strings, play pitch vibrato. And that means if you want to start or end the vibrato, the waves cannot end above or below the pitch level of the note. So when practicing your vibrato, you don't only need to practice having a beautiful vibrato, which you can vary the speed and the width, but also you need to need to practice that you start and end on the correct pitch. Also, if your vibrato gets too wide, the note will sound out of tune. And that's what I like to practice again with drones, because when you practice with drones, then hear the tonal center, and you can hear very, very easily if your vibrato gets too wide or too fast, for example, or you are starting and ending in the wrong place. Then on top of that, recording yourself is always a good idea, because we hear so much more when we are not actually playing the saxophone. I think that was most of the stuff that I wanted to cover regarding intonation, and I would like to open up the last 20 minutes of this session to questions about anything that I've said or anything else or whatever you'd like to talk about.
Okay, thank you. Derek Granger posted something in the chat. Derek, did you want to ask that yourself, or do you want to just read it? Yeah, there you go.
Sorry. Thank you. That was awesome. I just had a question or clarification about the overtone practice you were talking about. And you mentioned just practicing overtones with rhythm to isolate the parts of the tongue. And I just was wondering what that meant.
So usually when we practice overtones, we practice them as long tones, right? But if you you can choose any rhythm that you want. So you can start with simple quarter notes like T, D, D, D. Oh, okay. And if your tonguing affects the back of the tongue, which is often a problem in tonguing, then you'll hear that immediately, because the pitch will drop high or will drop low.
Okay.
And then you can make, you can make the rhythms more complicated over time, which, helps with being more precise. And also the higher you go on the overtone pitches, the harder it will be to actually keep the pitches stable. Like they will drop out more often in the higher register. So you need to be even more exact in the higher register. Okay. I do love that statement from Don Sinta too. The being slightly out of tune is like being slightly pregnant. I've heard that a lot already.
One of the statements that you said that I really liked is that people often tune notes rather than intervals.
Yeah.
And I thought, there's a lot there, because, and of course when you're talking about tuning with drones, hearing the unison against it, but also tuning that interval is so important, because obviously that's essential for when we're performing. I mean, we have to not only hear the note, we have to hear the interval. Do you have any exercises that you specifically do with chamber ensembles with tuning intervals as well?
Not any specific exercises. I like to use repertoire for that, and especially with saxophone quartet, the third is often the tenor's part, right? But it's so important to learn to hear that, and that's what I work with them on, that, so that they each learn to hear what actually sounds correct and what does not sound correct. With the hearing of the intervals, it's even more so important. It's not just hearing the interval, right? It's like that the note that you're coming from, the voicing, greatly alters the voicing for the next pitch. So if you're hitting a sharp note from a sharp note, you're already voicing low, and you might not change the voicing. Mm-hmm. So it's like a note has to be played differently depending on what note comes before. And that's what I find the hard part about intonation. Sure. So one step is hearing the interval, the other one is like knowing how to adjust your voicing depending on where you're coming from.
Yeah. So the hearing affects the physical motion.
Exactly.
Yeah. Not just the hearing. Good. I like it. Jan says there's nothing worse than being slightly pregnant.
Whatever that means.
Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Nobody's got questions.
No question. Okay.
Any non-intonation questions?
Hello.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
Willy?
have a question. Yeah, Diane.
Yeah.
Yeah. Genau. Okay. It's concerning the Altissimo register. So if I do the exercises in the mid range, I normally keyboard and I'm playing one note and play different intervals with a saxophone. So that is quite easy to judge whether I'm in tune or not. But if it gets to the higher register, it's different. So if I think I'm right in tune in very high level, and I look on the tuner, I register that it's out of tune.
Yeah.
So
That's
what could be a way to get to master this also in the very high altissimo range?
That's due to the fact that, first of all, we all tend to favor certain registers. Like for me, it's harder to hear extremely low. Like it gets hard for me to distinguish pitches and intervals, where in the normal register, it's fairly easy. The other is that in the high register, the intervals seem to be closer together. And also it's much harder in the altissimo to hold the correct pitch, right? Because every slight adjustment of like our tongue, every slight movement of the lip, for example, greatly alters the pitch. It's the same why playing soprano saxophone is much harder than playing alto, because when you think about adjusting your voicing on soprano, you're already, like a third flat. I in those registers, I work a lot with that Tonal Energy app because it shows you your intonation while playing the drone. It's not always perfectly correct, but especially with unisons, it works pretty good. Like the thirds, for example, it doesn't always show correctly. But for the normal altissimo notes, that should work relatively well. Does that answer your question, Willy?
That's what it's a tonal energy.
Tonal energy.
Yes, could you just tell me? Tonal energy, yes.
I'll put it in the chat. It's an app that is a metronome and a tuner.
Okay.
What I actually love to do with Tonal Energy too, and that's going even more crazy than some of the other exercises I do, is it has a recording function. And with the recording function, that you can reduce the playback speed of your playback. So then if you play like you normally would play, you can reduce the speed when it plays back, and then you can check on the tuner how in or out of tune you were. So it's just another way of practicing and checking up on yourself.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it has that function where you can play drones and you see how out of tune you are.
Okay.
And then also recently it got an update to the metronome. So now it has a random silence function of the metronome, which I love. I used to use a different app for that because I always find working with the metronome so stupid, right? Because we tend to rely on the beat rather than learning how to count and learning how to feel the time. And when the metronome randomly stops, and you can, change the percentage of the metronome doing so, then you realize really quickly whether or not you're counting yourself. So it's a great app.
Yeah.
I could be a salesperson for that app.
There are two other questions.
Okay.
One of them is from Sean Gard, and he asks, how do you work on tuning quarter tones or other microtonal intervals? So do you have any specific things you do for that?
No, the same that I do with the other intervals. Besides that, I do way more just tuner work because it's like so much harder to hear. But I when I play pieces with quarter tones, I often play quarter tone scales in my warm up. It's like the same as when you play a lot of altissimo. Then you know, like in your warm up, you put a lot of exercises, including altissimo. And I do the same with microtones because I feel like only if I do that, especially scales, then I learn to hear how big that interval really is. And then you get so used to it that it becomes part of the normal language of your music making, and you don't think about it anymore. But with microtones, I have to check with the tuner all the time.
One of the issues that I've found with working on microtones is a lot of those fingerings really alter the timbre or alter the resonance. And so like I've found that, you know, even the traditional fingerings I'm having to vent differently because, you know, it might be very stuffy versus the next note next to it is resonant. So yeah, it's internals, it's fingerings, it's kind of all combined.
And it's everything that intonation is, but much worse. It's like
Nice.
worse than playing soprano saxophone.
Yeah.
And I love playing soprano saxophone.
Yeah. And one other question Sammy asked, which is any suggestions to correct getting an airy sound when we play? I mean, have you, you know, he's heard use more mouthpiece, use less mouthpiece, change reeds, etc. Just more of a, you know, pedagogical question about tone concept.
To get rid of airy sound or to get airy sound?
To correct it, so to fix the airy sound.
Yeah. I think that airy sound often comes from the wrong lip tension. So, you know, like if you even like slightly tighten your corners, of course, you know, like you want to round around the mouthpiece, but I always have the corners a little bit pulled back. And I feel like if I get lazy with that, that's when the airy sound creeps in. On a very basic level, when I used to live in Buffalo and the weather changed every 5 seconds, it was just very crucial to check that the bottom of the reed was super flat. That's when I was best friends with my reed geek. I would use that a lot. My quartet mates would always laugh about me. But for me, that airy sound would creep in whenever the reed wasn't flat. So I would be curious with him if he would have the same problem playing with a Leger reed, for example. But I would experiment with the lip tension with the corners and see if that changes anything. And then long tones and just seeing what makes it go away and then just trying out. I mean, I feel like with everything saxophone, like it's so individual, right? It's so different for all of us. So whatever works for me might not work for somebody else, or it's likely that it doesn't work. And I feel like we are all not experimenting enough. Like we all have to just know what the sound is that we're looking for, and then just go hunting for that. And then do whatever is necessary to make that come out of the saxophone. I once had a very, very interesting conversation with Claude DeLonge about similar things, like, you know, changing tone and stuff like that. And he always, you know, like he's the biggest equipment geek out there. He always has something else just because he wants to sound better. And that guy said to me, Diana, the saxophone is much, much more flexible than you think it is. You just make it sound the way you want it to sound. And so when I go too crazy about some things, I try to remember that and just try to remember that I need to work on myself. It's the same as with a G sharp. I made my saxophone play out of tune. It was not the saxophone playing out of tune. And that's just in my mind doing the wrong thing.
So you trained your ear incorrectly on that G sharp.
Exactly. Right. You know, wherever that was coming from a previous saxophone that actually had a flat G sharp or something like that, and I got used to that pitch or something like that, or not enough drone work or whatever, you know, like it's also a matter of not accepting that airy sound, right? It's like if you don't accept that that's there, then you go hunting, and that's like so much easier said than done, right? I
Right.
mean, probably that's a much bigger problem than me just saying go practice.
I'll say a flat G sharp is remarkable. I've yet to run into one. So if anything, mine tend to creep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jan just typed in, he'll perform a concert on something he literally just bought from a showroom at a conference. Yeah, I've seen that too. Or like brand new reeds, just famously takes a reed out of the wrapper and goes on the stage. I mean,
it's just something like, especially taking reeds out of a wrapper and playing a concert, that's like the worst nightmare of my life.
Just a thrill seeker. Living on the edge.
I don't know how he does that. It's crazy.
Nor do I. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? None? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's really great information. Always nice to hear, intonation concepts. I mean, we all need more. So
yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
One more question, I think.
Oh, sure.
Curious about the equipment change you made recently from Sean. Sean, you're talking about my buffet?
Horn?
Yeah, I mean, about like 1.5 years ago, I switched my alto from the Bücher to the buffet Senso. And I like to try things. I like to try a lot of things. And I got curious about that instrument, and I tried it in a shop in northern Germany. That was like right when I got the job in Detmold. And it was the first saxophone for me in a long time where I liked the tone quality. I felt like I immediately had like some sort of flexibility on it. And it was just very, very easy to play. And so I took it with me just to try it out a little bit more. And I always did that because I thought it was just a research project for me. But then I actually liked the saxophone a lot. I noticed that a lot of things were just way easier than on my Bücher alto. I realized that I needed to practice less. I realized that it still had tuning tendencies, but they were just less pronounced than my Bücher. So all in all, it just seemed to make my life so much easier. And I still think I prefer the sound from my Bücher alto, but the Senso more easily gets different colors, especially the lighter colors, which I always had to work for a lot on my Bücher. And also tonguing variety is a lot easier. And so, yeah, the saxophone kind of found me, and it stuck with me. It's what I've been playing for 1.5 years.
That's cool. I didn't know that. So, I mean, certainly the key work is so much different than on a Bücher.
Yeah, the key work is different. I do enjoy having the high F sharp though. That kind of makes up for a lot of the other changes, because it's like not that one needs a high F sharp to play, but it just gives you other fingering options, not only in altissimo but also in multiphonics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so it just seemed to make sense for me right now to play it a little bit. Yeah. The key work actually is like the one thing that I had a hard time getting used to was the left hand thumb rest. Like the other key work, sort of like I took the saxophone in my hand and I was like, this feels natural. Like in a way, like the Bücher always felt natural to me too, like from the moment that I picked it up, but in a different way. Like, And what I liked is like how even the spring tension was, and the spring tension in general, that was a lot different, but it also made it possible for me to relax my hand a little bit more, which then you can play faster. But the left hand thumb rest, is it called a thumb rest? I don't even know. But
I think so. We'll call it a thumb rest. I think.
it has the weirdest angle on the buffet Senso. It's like way tilted to the left, like in a way that no Yamaha or no Yanagisawa or Selma has a thumb rest like that. And it always gave me the feeling that the saxophone would tilt to the left.
Interesting.
So, but now I got a replacement thumb rest. One, you know, the one with the lid that goes up, that Will Peak Designs. He made one for my buffet, and he's actually sending me an updated version, and like at the end of February. It's awesome. Like my repairman put it on, and the entire problem was gone. And you can even adjust the angle that the lid goes up, so you can adjust it to your hands. And I have fairly large hands, so that was majorly helpful.
That's cool. I'm aware of those. I've yet to try one, but I've heard good things.
Yeah, he mainly, I think, invented them to make soprano playing easier, to open up the hand position. But for me, it was really a game changer, because like I was like, there's no way I can play the saxophone, no matter how much I like some things about it, if I constantly feel like it's slipping my hands, right?
Right.
So now it doesn't feel like that anymore. So it's like 90% of the problem gone.
That's cool.
I actually feel like it's, Sean wrote again, if it's quite a change going from a modern horn to your tenor for mana quartet. I don't find that a problem at all, actually. Like, also not switching to soprano. It's a different way of playing a saxophone anyway when you switch sizes. So it's just, you play alto different than you play tenor, and most people don't have tenor and alto saxophones that play the same and have all the tendencies. So it's different anyway to play those and switch those. From the first moment, I didn't have a problem switching back to my tenor at all.
That's cool.
I did pick up the Bisher Alto a couple days ago, and that seemed harder to play than 1.5 years ago. But that might just be that it's been sitting, or I've just been getting used to the buffet Senso so much.
Is Senso only on alto right now?
Yeah, it's only on alto. They are working on soprano and tenor, as I heard at some NASA conference, but that's been a while ago, and I'm not sure what the status is on that.
Yeah.
But it's a saxophone, like, I don't know, for me it just it had, you know, like, it sort of, the sound is in between a Selma and a Bisher. Like a Bisher can be too dark. A Selma for me can be too bright. I mean, everybody has their tendencies or their preferences, right? We just have to find something that works for us. And at this point in my life, it just seems to work really well for me.
Well, the old copper buffets are famously, you know, beautiful horns.
Yeah.
I've never been able to try one, but I've, you know,
I've recently tried one, and it's a very, very special sound.
Yeah.
The tuning is challenging. Like, I'm sure if one spends a lot of time with it, one can get used to that. I mean, you can get used to a lot of things, but the sound was really special.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep my eyes out on eBay.
Good luck.
I don't think they come open too often.
Nope. And there are a lot of people in Holland playing them, so they usually get first dibs somehow.
Right. Well, hey, thank you so much. Really, really great information. Wonderful to talk with you. And if you wouldn't mind, you don't have to share the PowerPoint, but at least there were some links on there that I didn't get a chance to copy. Would you mind sending some of those just so I can put those up along with the notes?
No problem at all.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for joining in today.
Yeah. All right. Hey, have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.